The scream cut through the desert like a razor. It wasn't the howl of a coyote or the cry of a hawk. No, this was human, raw, and full of terror. Samuel Hayes dropped his coffee tin, the bitter brew hissing on the dying embers of his campfire. In one smooth motion, a ghost of a man he used to be, his hand found the cold, familiar stock of his Winchester. His knuckles were white, his eyes, the color of a stormy sky, scanned the darkness. 42 years old, carved from the same hard rock and regret as the canyon he called home. He'd come out to this god-forsaken patch of Arizona territory to be alone, to let the silence swallow the memories of a woman's cough and a future turned to dust. The last thing he needed was somebody else's trouble. Another scream, closer, a woman, young. He swore under his breath, a low rumble like shifting stones. He moved from the firelight, melting into the shadows beside his supply wagon. He peered through a crack between two crates, his heart a slow, heavy drum against his ribs. And that's when he saw them. 3 riders, their horses lathered in sweat, dancing on the edge of his camp. They were hard men, the kind that left a trail of cheap whiskey and cheaper graves. Between them, on a small, tired pony, was a girl. Couldn't have been more than 18. Her black hair whipped around her face like a storm cloud. And even from a distance, tied and terrified, she held her chin up with a defiance that made Samuel's own bitter heart skip a beat. She was Apache. The beadwork on her buckskin dress caught the moonlight like scattered stars. The leader, a bear of a man with a beard caked in dust and sin, yanked on the rope that bound her. His name was Jake Morrison, a name whispered in saloons and cursed by sheriffs, a name Samuel knew all too well. "You keep fighting, Ayanna," Morrison growled, his voice like gravel grinding on bone, "and I'll string you up right here. The bounty says dead or alive. Don't tempt me." Ayanna, granddaughter of Chief Nolish, a name worth $500, enough to make a man forget his conscience, enough to bring the vultures circling. But something was wrong. Samuel had seen fear. He knew its smell, its taste. This wasn't it. The girl's eyes weren't wide with terror. They were sharp, calculating. She wasn't just a captive. She was a hunter in a trap, looking for the weakest link. Then she looked right at him, right through the darkness, right through the cracks in the crate. It was impossible, but her eyes locked onto his hiding spot. And in that moment, she didn't look like she was pleading for help. She looked like she was giving an order. "My grandfather will feed your bones to the coyotes, Jake Morrison," she said, her voice clear and cold with no tremble of fear. Morrison laughed and backhanded her. The crack echoed in the canyon. That was it. That was the line. Samuel had buried the man who cared, the man who was a hero, right next to his wife, Sarah. But seeing that girl, bloody-lipped and unbroken, it was like digging him back up with his bare hands. He stepped out from behind the wagon. The Winchester felt like an extension of his arm. Its barrel pointed steady at Morrison's black heart. "That's far enough," Samuel said, his voice a low growl that the desert itself seemed to respect. The 3 men spun around, their hands hovering over their pistols. Morrison's eyes, small and cruel, narrowed. "Well, I'll be Samuel Hayes, the ghost of Copper Canyon. Heard you went soft." "You heard wrong," Samuel said, the words tasting like rust and gunpowder. "Now cut her loose." Morrison chuckled, a nasty wet sound. "She's worth a fortune, Hayes. More than you'll ever dig out of this dirt. Walk away." "Can't do that." The air grew thick, stretched tight like a hangman's rope. The other 2 bounty hunters shifted in their saddles, spooked by the dead certainty in Samuel's eyes. Ayanna watched, her face a mask of stone. "You have to understand, a man with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous man in the world. And Samuel had lost it all years ago, or so he thought. 1 rifle against 3? Morrison sneered. "You've been alone too long, old man. You forgot how to count." "Maybe," Samuel said, his finger tightening on the trigger. "But I know something you don't." The world exploded in a flash of fire and thunder. Samuel's shot hit Morrison in the shoulder, the impact throwing the big man back. A bullet from the second man screamed past Samuel's ear, so close he felt its heat. He worked the lever on the Winchester. the shuck click a prayer he knew by heart, and put a round straight through the second man's chest. He dropped from his horse like a sack of grain. The third one, a kid barely old enough to grow a beard, panicked. He fired wild, his horse rearing. He tumbled to the ground, scrambling for cover. And that's when Ayana made her move. She didn't cower. She didn't scream. With her hands still bound, she drove her heels into her pony, launching the small animal forward. She threw herself from the saddle, not away from the fight, but into it. She rolled, coming up near the panicking kid, and with a speed that defied belief, she kicked his gun from his hand. It happened so fast, Samuel almost didn't process it. The boy stared at his empty hand, then at the girl who was now on her feet, a storm in her eyes. Samuel didn't hesitate. He swung the rifle, but he didn't shoot the kid. He shot the rope that bound Ayana's hands. The bullet sang through the air, and the rope fell away. Morrison, clutching his bleeding shoulder, stared in disbelief. He saw his two partners down, his prize free. He cursed, a long string of filth that polluted the clean desert air, and spurred his horse into the night, vanishing into the shadows he came from. Silence descended, heavy. The smell of gunpowder hung in the air. The kid was frozen, staring at Ayana, then at Samuel, then back again. He was shaking like a leaf. Ayana didn't even look at him. She walked over to the man Samuel had shot clean through. She knelt, but not to check for life. Her hands moved with a purpose that sent a chill down Samuel's spine. She searched his pockets, his saddlebags. What was she looking for? "Thank you," she said, her back still to him, her voice calm, almost casual. She finally stood up, holding a small, worn leather pouch. It was tied shut with a thick sinew. "But you shouldn't have shot the rope." Samuel frowned, lowering the Winchester. "What are you talking about? You're free." She turned to face him then, and the look in her eyes wasn't gratitude. It was something else, something harder. "I'm free," she agreed, tucking the pouch securely into her dress. "But you just made a terrible mistake." He just stared at her, the world tilting on its axis. The helpless captive was gone. In her place stood a woman with eyes as old as the mountains, and a secret clutched in her hand. "That bounty," she said, her voice dropping low. "It wasn't for me." Samuel's mind reeled. "What do you mean it wasn't for you? Morrison called you by name. He said the bounty was on your head." "Morrison is a fool," she said, her gaze flicking to the darkness where the bounty hunter had fled. "He thinks what everyone thinks. He sees a girl, the granddaughter of a chief, and he assumes. But men like him, they only see the surface." She walked over to his campfire, moving with a grace that was almost unnerving. She wasn't a victim seeking shelter. She was a general assessing a battlefield. She picked up his coffee pot, poured the last of the lukewarm liquid into his tin cup, and drank it down without flinching. "The bounty," she said, setting the cup down, "is for this." She held up the small leather pouch. "What's in it?" Samuel asked, his voice rough. She gave him a look that was part pity, part challenge. "Something more valuable than $500? Something worth starting a war over." A cold dread began to seep into Samuel's bones, colder than any winter night. He had just stepped into the middle of something he couldn't possibly understand. He had killed a man and made an enemy of another, all for a girl who didn't seem to need his help at all. "So who are you?" he asked, the question hanging in the air between them. "I am Ayana," she said simply. "But I am not just my grandfather's kin. I am his messenger, his right hand. And you," she said, her eyes boring into him, "are the man who just declared war on the people who want this message silenced." The kid on the ground finally found his voice, whimpering. Ayana glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "He's seen too much," she said. "He's just a boy," Samuel countered, stepping between her and the terrified bounty hunter. "Boys grow into men like Morrison," she replied, her tone leaving no room for argument. "And loose ends get people killed. You should know that. A man who lives alone learns to be tidy." There it was again, that sharp, unsettling intelligence. She saw right through him. She saw the grief, the isolation, the carefully constructed walls he'd built around his heart, and she was using it against him. "We need to move," she said, ignoring the boy for now. "Morrison will be back, and he won't be alone." He knows where your claim is. This place isn't safe anymore. Samuel looked around at his camp, his home, the only place in the world that felt like his, a shabby collection of tools, a wagon, and a fire pit. It wasn't much, but it was the tomb he'd chosen for himself, and she was telling him to abandon it. I know a place, he heard himself say, the words coming out before he could stop them. An old mine shaft. It's hidden. We can lay low there. Why would you help me? She asked, her head tilted. You have what you wanted. You played the hero. Why not just send me on my way? He didn't have an answer, not a real one. He could talk about the memory of his wife, Sarah. He could talk about right and wrong. But the truth was, for the first time in 3 years, he felt something other than the dull ache of loss. He felt a spark, a dangerous, terrifying spark of purpose. Because Morrison knows my name, he said, the lie tasting thin on his tongue. Your trouble is my trouble now. She smiled, a quick, sharp thing that didn't reach her eyes. Is it? Or did you just miss the taste of it? Before he could answer, she walked over to the whimpering boy. She knelt down, her shadow falling over him. She said something to him in her own tongue, her voice soft but firm. The boy's eyes went wide. He scrambled to his feet, turned, and ran into the desert without looking back, as if the devil himself were on his heels. What did you tell him? Samuel asked, his hand still tight on his rifle. She stood up, brushing the dust from her dress. I told him that the ghost of Copper Canyon doesn't like witnesses, and that if he ever came back, you would finish the job. She looked Samuel dead in the eye. I hope you can live up to the reputation I just gave you. He felt a shiver trace its way down his spine. This was no girl. This was a queen, a warrior, a force of nature, and he had just tied his fate to hers with a knot of gunpowder and blood. They gathered what they could: water, ammunition, a little food. Every sound in the night was the footfall of Morrison's ghost, coming back for revenge. As they prepared to leave, Ayanna paused by the stream that trickled through Samuel's claim. The moonlight hit the water, and for a second he saw it, tiny glittering particles, like golden dust, swirling in the current. He'd seen them before, thought it was just mica, fool's gold. Ayanna reached into the stream, letting the water run through her fingers. She looked at the golden flecks on her palm, then up at the mountain that loomed over them, the mountain Samuel had been digging into for 3 years. You've been sleeping on a dragon's hoard, Samuel Hayes, she whispered, her voice filled with a strange awe. And you never even knew it. The mine shaft was a dark slash in the hillside, hidden by a tangle of mesquite and rockfall. It smelled of damp earth and forgotten things. Samuel lit a torch, the flame pushing back the oppressive darkness. The tunnel ran straight for about 50 feet before opening into a small, dry chamber. It was exactly as he'd left it years ago. It's not much, he said, his voice echoing in the small space. It's hidden, Ayanna countered, her eyes scanning every corner. She ran a hand along the rock wall, her fingers tracing the tool marks. Someone spent a long time here, chasing a dream. Most dreams out here end up as nightmares, Samuel said, setting down their supplies. He started to build a small, smokeless fire in a pit left by the original miner. The silence was thick between them. He was acutely aware of her presence, of the mystery she carried in that leather pouch, of the danger she had dragged into his quiet life. You knew Morrison's name, she said suddenly, her voice cutting through the quiet. It wasn't a question. Samuel froze. He's a known man. No, she said, stepping closer, the firelight dancing in her dark eyes. You said his name before he did. You knew him. Personally. The air left Samuel's lungs. He turned away, busying himself with the fire, but he could feel her gaze on his back. The past was a grave, and she was digging it up with a shovel. We crossed paths once, he said, the lie heavy in his mouth. Up in Colorado. The place you told me about? Where you were mining before? Before your wife? He didn't answer. He just stared into the flames, but he wasn't seeing the fire. He was seeing a younger version of himself, full of hope. He was seeing Sarah, her smile bright enough to light up the darkest mine. And he was seeing Jake Morrison, not as a bounty hunter, but as a partner. His partner. The man who had been his friend. He was there, Samuel finally admitted, the words like pulling teeth. We worked a claim together, the three of us, me, Sarah, and Jake. Ayana was silent, but he could feel her waiting, listening. The claim was rich, he continued, his voice hollow, richer than we'd ever dreamed. We were going to be set for life. Buy a ranch, start a family, all of it. He clenched his fists. Then the greed set in. Jake. He changed. He started talking about cutting corners, about cheating the assay office. I wouldn't do it. I told him our word and our honor were worth more than all the silver in the mountain. And Sarah agreed with you, Ayana said softly. Samuel nodded, a lump forming in his throat. She was the most honest person I ever knew. She told Jake that if he cheated, he'd be no better than a thief. He didn't like that. They argued. It got ugly. He took a shaky breath. A week later, there was a cave-in. A support beam I'd checked myself just that morning suddenly gave way. I was pinned. My leg was crushed. Sarah. Sarah was deeper in the tunnel. He choked on the memory. She was trapped. Jake was the only one close enough to help her. I begged him. I screamed for him to get her out. The fire crackled, the only sound in the suffocating silence. What did he do? Ayana whispered. He looked at me, Samuel said, his voice breaking. He looked at me, with all that rock crushing me, and he smiled. Then he turned, walked out of the mine, and collapsed the entrance behind him. He left us there to die. He finally turned to face her, the agony of the memory twisting his features. I managed to dig myself out. Took me 2 days. But by the time I got to Sarah, it was too late. The sickness, the dust from the cave-in, it got into her lungs. The doctor called it consumption, but I know what it was. It was Jake Morrison. He killed her as sure as if he'd put a bullet in her heart. Ayana stared at him, her own fierce exterior cracking for just a moment, revealing a depth of empathy that startled him. She didn't offer empty words of comfort. She just stood there, a silent witness to his pain. I tried to find him, Samuel confessed. Tracked him for a year, but he disappeared. The silver from our claim was gone. He'd registered it all in his name, said we'd died in the accident. By the time I could walk right again, he was a ghost. So I came here, to disappear, too. He slumped down against the rock wall, the weight of his confession crushing him. So you see, when I saw him tonight, it wasn't about the bounty. It wasn't about doing the right thing. It was about revenge. No, Ayana said, her voice firm. She walked over and knelt in front of him. Revenge would have been shooting him in the back as he fled. You shot his partners. You freed me. You chose justice, even when your heart wanted vengeance. She reached out and for the first time touched him. Her hand rested on his arm, her touch surprisingly gentle. The man you were with, Sarah, he's not as buried as you think. Her words hit him harder than any bullet. He looked at this young woman who carried the fate of her people in a small leather pouch and felt a profound, undeniable connection. They were both haunted, both survivors. Suddenly, a sound from the tunnel entrance. The scuff of a boot on rock. They both froze. Samuel's hand shot to his Winchester. Ayana drew a long, wicked-looking knife from a sheath hidden in her boot. They looked at each other in the flickering firelight, a silent understanding passing between them. Morrison had found them, and this time he hadn't come for a bounty. He'd come to finish what he started all those years ago. The silence outside the mine entrance was worse than any noise. It was a loaded silence, thick with menace. Samuel extinguished the fire with a handful of dirt, plunging the chamber into near-total darkness. Only a sliver of moonlight from the entrance cut through the black. He's not alone, Ayana whispered, her voice so low it was more a feeling than a sound. I hear at least 4 of them. Samuel's heart hammered against his ribs. He was a good shot, but 4-1 in a confined space? Those were killer's odds. He was a miner, not a soldier. But then he looked at the rock walls around him, the tool marks Ayana had pointed out. He knew this place. He knew its bones. The original shaft, he breathed, an idea sparking in the darkness of his mind. It follows a fault line. The old-timer who dug this, he gave up right before he hit the main vein. But there's another tunnel, a ventilation shaft. It's small, but it leads up to the top of the ridge. Can we get to it? It's back there, he pointed deeper into the chamber. He boarded it up. We'd have to break through. A voice echoed from the entrance, distorted by the tunnel. It was Morrison. Hayes, I know you're in there. You and the girl. I've got 4 rifles out here, and they're all pointed at that hole. You can come out and die quick, or we can wait for you to starve. Your choice. Samuel and Ayanna exchanged a look. Starving wasn't the plan. Buy me time, Samuel whispered. He scrambled toward the back of the chamber, his hands searching the rock face in the dark. He found it. A section that felt different. Wooden planks, hidden behind a thin facade of rock and clay. What do you have in that pouch of yours, girl? Morrison yelled. Chief Nolish send you out with the tribe's grocery money? Whatever it is, my employer wants it, and he pays better than the government. His employer, so Morrison was just a hired dog. This was bigger than a simple bounty, bigger than revenge. Ayanna moved to the mouth of the chamber, staying deep in the shadows. Your employer is a coward, Morrison, she shouted, her voice ringing with authority. He sends dogs to do his dirty work because he doesn't have the courage to face my grandfather himself. My employer owns this territory, girl. He owns the politicians, the army. He'll own your grandfather's bones when this is over. While they shouted, Samuel worked. He used the butt of his Winchester, striking the disguised wall. It was slow work. The wood was old but thick. Each thud seemed deafeningly loud. What was that noise, Hayes? Morrison roared. You getting restless in there? A gunshot suddenly erupted. The bullet ricocheted wildly down the tunnel, whining like an angry hornet. Samuel flinched, pressing himself against the rock. They were getting impatient. Tell me about Sarah, Ayanna called out, her voice changing, becoming softer, conversational. Samuel said she was a teacher. Samuel paused his work, confused. What was she doing? Shut up about his dead wife, Morrison spat. That won't work on me. It's not for you, Ayanna's voice was clear and calm. It's for him. A man needs to remember what he's fighting for. You took everything from him once, Morrison. You think he'll let you do it again? Her words struck a chord deep inside him. Sarah. He wasn't just fighting for Ayanna. He was fighting for the memory of the man Sarah had loved. A man who didn't run. A man who didn't hide. He slammed the rifle butt into the wall with renewed strength. A plank cracked. Then another. Splinters flew. That's it, Hayes. We're coming in. Samuel heard the crunch of boots in the tunnel. They were making their move. He put his shoulder to the weakened planks and pushed with all his might. The wood groaned, then splintered, giving way. A rush of cool night air hit his face. Freedom. Go! He hissed to Ayanna. Get up the shaft. She didn't hesitate. She squeezed through the opening into the narrow ventilation shaft. It was a tight fit, more of a chimney than a tunnel, leading straight up into the rock. Samuel turned back, peering toward the main chamber. He could see the silhouettes of 2 men entering, their guns raised. He lifted the Winchester, took a steadying breath, and fired. The roar of the rifle in the enclosed space was deafening. One of the silhouettes crumpled to the ground. The other fired back blindly, bullets sparking off the rock walls around Samuel's head. He didn't wait to see more. He scrambled through the opening and began the arduous climb up the ventilation shaft, his boots finding purchase on the rough-hewn rock. Below him, he could hear enraged shouting. They knew they'd been tricked. He climbed, his muscles burning, his lungs screaming for air. Above him, he could see Ayanna, a dark shape against a patch of starry sky. They were going to make it. He pulled himself over the top, emerging from a narrow crack in the rocks on top of the ridge. He lay on the ground, gasping for breath, the cool desert air a balm on his raw throat. Ayanna was already on her feet, scanning their surroundings. They were high above the mine entrance, with a clear view of the canyon below. They could see Morrison and his 2 remaining men, dragging their fallen comrade out of the tunnel. Morrison looked up at the ridge, his face a mask of pure fury in the moonlight. He knew where they were. They'll come after us, Samuel said, getting to his feet and reloading the Winchester. Let them, Ayanna said, a grim smile on her face. They were hunters. Now, they are the prey. We are on my ground now. She pointed north toward a series of jagged peaks that looked like teeth against the night sky. That way, the Dragon's Tooth. My people are waiting. But as they turned to run, A new sound reached them, not from the canyon below but from the ridge ahead, the sound of a dozen horses moving fast, and the quiet, deadly jingle of military hardware. Out of the darkness a line of riders appeared. They weren't Morrison's men, and they weren't Apache. They were dressed in dark, unmarked uniforms, carrying repeating rifles, moving with the disciplined precision of soldiers. They formed a perfect line, blocking their path. A man at the front of the line, his face half hidden by a wide-brimmed hat, raised a hand. "Ayana of the Chiricahua," he called out, his voice calm and cultured, completely out of place in the rugged wilderness. "And Samuel Hayes, a pleasure to finally make your acquaintance. Mr. Morrison was simply the appetizer. I am the main course." He stepped his horse forward into a patch of moonlight. Samuel's blood ran cold. He was older, his hair gray at the temples, but the face was unmistakable. It was a face he'd seen in newspapers and on wanted posters in a dozen territories. It was Alistair Finch, the railroad baron, the man who was buying up all the land in the territory, the man they called the Vulture of Arizona, the employer Morrison had spoken of, and standing right beside him, a smug, triumphant look on his face, was the kid, the young bounty hunter Ayana had let go. He'd run straight to the real boss. They were trapped, caught between Morrison's petty thugs below and a private army above. There was no way out. "The pouch, if you please," Finch said, his voice polite but edged with steel. "Let's not make this any more unpleasant than it has to be." Alistair Finch sat on his horse like a king on a throne, the moonlight glinting off the silver inlay of his saddle. He looked more like a banker than a killer, with his clean-shaven face and tailored coat. But Samuel knew men like Finch. They were the most dangerous kind. They didn't pull the trigger themselves. They bought the men who did. "What do you want with my people?" Ayana demanded, her hand hovering over the knife in her boot. Finch smiled, a cold, thin-lipped expression. "My dear girl, I have no quarrel with your people. I have a quarrel with progress. Or rather, the lack of it. Your grandfather, Chief Nolish, is sitting on the richest gold deposit this side of the Mississippi. He refuses to sell. He refuses to negotiate. He is, in short, bad for business. Gold, not silver, the golden particles in the stream." Ayana's words came back to him. "You've been sleeping on a dragon's hoard." It wasn't his claim. It was the whole mountain, the entire canyon. It was Apache land, sacred land. "That pouch," Finch continued, gesturing with a gloved hand, "contains the final survey maps, drawn by a government man my predecessor paid handsomely for. Maps that prove the extent of the gold vein. Maps that, combined with a hostile Apache uprising, will give the territorial government all the excuse it needs to nullify your grandfather's treaty and seize the land." It all clicked into place. The bounty wasn't just to get the maps. It was to provoke a war. Killing or capturing Ayana was meant to force Chief Nolish's hand, to make him fight back, to turn him into the savage the newspapers were already claiming he was. "You're a monster," Samuel spat, raising his Winchester. Finch chuckled. "I'm a businessman, Mr. Hayes. You of all people should understand. I've read your file. The Colorado claim, the partnership with Mr. Morrison, the tragic accident. You see, I do my homework. In fact, it was I who located Mr. Morrison and gave him a new profitable career after his hasty departure from Colorado. I've been cleaning up his messes for years." The world tilted again. Finch wasn't just Morrison's current employer. He was the man who had been pulling the strings all along. He was the reason Morrison had gotten away clean. He was the reason Samuel's life had been destroyed. "The cave-in," Samuel whispered, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. "That was you." "A necessary business expense," Finch said with a shrug. "The claim was too rich for a small-timer like you. My associates and I had bigger plans for it. Sarah was an unfortunate complication. Too principled. She wouldn't have played along." Rage, pure and white-hot, burned through Samuel. It wasn't grief anymore. It wasn't even revenge. It was a demand for cosmic justice. He aimed the rifle squarely at Finch's chest, but before he could pull the trigger, Ayana grabbed his arm. "No," she said, her voice urgent. "Not like this. That's what he wants." She was right. If he shot Finch, this private army would slaughter them, and it would be reported as an unprovoked attack. It would be the spark that started the fire. Very wise, my dear, Finch said approvingly. Now, the maps. Ayanna looked at Samuel, her eyes conveying a silent message. Then she looked at the pouch in her hand. She seemed to weigh her options, her face a mask of conflict. Then with a sigh of defeat, she tossed the leather pouch onto the ground in front of Finch's horse. The kid, the young bounty hunter, scurried forward to pick it up, a triumphant smirk on his face. He handed it up to Finch. Finch took the pouch, but he didn't open it. He just smiled. Thank you for your cooperation. Of course, this doesn't change anything. You've both seen too much. He raised his hand, a signal to his men. Kill them. Make it look like they fought each other. The soldiers raised their rifles. This was it, the end of the line. Samuel stood his ground, ready to take as many of them with him as he could. He looked at Ayanna, ready to die beside this fierce, incredible woman. But Ayanna wasn't looking at the soldiers. She was looking at the ground, and she was smiling. You should have opened it first, Alistair, she said, her voice ringing with triumph. Finch frowned, his composure finally breaking. He fumbled with the sinew tie on the pouch. He pulled it open and turned it upside down. Nothing came out. Nothing but a handful of common desert sand and a single, perfectly round, smooth river stone. Finch stared at the stone in his palm, his face a picture of confusion, which quickly curdled into rage. Where are they? He screamed, his voice cracking. Where are the maps? Ayanna's smile widened. A good messenger knows that sometimes the most important part of the message is the part you don't carry. She tapped her temple with her finger. They're in here. Every line, every landmark, memorized. My people don't trust paper. We trust memory. The pouch was a decoy, for fools like Morrison, and for fools like you. For a moment there was a stunned silence on the ridgetop. Finch and his men had been played, beautifully, but the moment didn't last. Kill them! Finch shrieked, his face purple with fury. Kill them now! The soldiers leveled their rifles again, but just as the first shot was about to be fired, a new sound filled the night. A sound that started as a low whistle, then grew into a chorus of piercing, terrifying war cries. From the rocks all around them, figures rose up, dozens of them, Apache warriors, materializing out of the darkness, as if they were born from the rock itself. They were armed with bows, lances, and rifles. In seconds, Finch and his private army were surrounded, hopelessly outnumbered. At the head of the warriors stood a tall, imposing man, with hair as white as snow, and eyes that held the wisdom of a century. He carried himself with an unshakable dignity. Chief Nolish. He had been there all along, watching, waiting. Finch's men froze, their military discipline evaporating in the face of the silent, deadly warriors who now held their lives in their hands. You are trespassing, Alistair Finch, Chief Nolish said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of the mountain. This has been my people's land since the beginning of time. It is not for sale. Finch, trapped and exposed, sputtered. This is an act of war. The army will hear the story of a peaceful tribe defending its land from an illegal armed force, led by a man wanted for murder in 3 territories, Nolish interrupted, his gaze shifting to Samuel. They will hear the testimony of Samuel Hayes, a man you left for dead, a man whose wife you murdered. The trap hadn't been for Samuel and Ayanna. The entire chase, the decoy, the confrontation on the ridge, it had all been a trap for Finch. Ayanna wasn't just a messenger, she was the bait, and Finch had swallowed it whole. The young bounty hunter, seeing the tables had turned so completely, made a desperate move. He drew his pistol and aimed it at Ayanna. Stay back, he shrieked. I'll shoot her! But he never got the chance. An arrow, silent and impossibly fast, flew from the darkness and buried itself in his gun hand. He screamed, dropping the pistol. The battle, when it came, was not a battle at all. It was a reckoning. Finch's men, seeing their leader exposed and their situation hopeless, threw down their weapons. They were professionals, not fanatics. They weren't willing to die for Alistair Finch's greed. But Finch himself was a cornered rat. He spurred his horse, trying to break through the Apache line, firing his pistol wildly. Samuel saw his chance. It wasn't revenge that drove him now. It was a cold, clear sense of justice. He raised the Winchester, took aim not at Finch, but at his horse. The rifle bucked against his shoulder. The horse went down, screaming, throwing Finch to the rocky ground. He lay there, his leg twisted at an unnatural angle, his fine coat covered in dust. He looked up to see Chief Nolish, Ayanna, and Samuel standing over him. The fight was over, but down in the canyon, a new sound began. Hoofbeats, lots of them. Morrison, he was coming back, and he'd brought every lowlife and fortune seeker he could find. He'd heard the gunshots and smelled the blood, and he was coming to claim whatever scraps were left. Chief Nolish looked from the pathetic form of Alistair Finch on the ground to the approaching dust cloud in the canyon below. "It seems," he said, his voice grim, "the night is not yet over." The dust cloud grew closer, resolving into a chaotic mob of riders. Morrison was at their head, his arm in a crude sling, his face twisted with greed and rage. He'd rallied a small army of prospectors and gunslingers, promising them a share of the bounty and a piece of the Apache gold. "There they are," Morrison bellowed, pointing up at the ridge. "Kill the savages and the traitor with them. The mountain is ours." The mob surged forward, a wave of desperation and violence. Chief Nolish's warriors raised their weapons, a silent, deadly line of defense. "This is what Finch wanted," Ayanna said, her voice tight. "A massacre he can blame on us." "But he won't be the one telling the story," Samuel said, a plan forming in his mind, born from years of knowing this mountain's secrets. He turned to Nolish. "Chief, I can stop them, but I need your men." Nolish studied him for a long moment, his ancient eyes weighing Samuel's soul. "What do you propose, Samuel Hayes?" "This mountain is riddled with my old tunnels," Samuel explained, speaking quickly. "They connect all over this ridge, and the main mine, the one Finch thinks is just a silver claim, it's unstable. I used very few support beams because I never planned on anyone else going in there, especially not at the main entrance right below us." Understanding dawned on Ayanna's face. "A cave-in." "A big one," Samuel confirmed. "If we can collapse the main entrance, we can block the canyon. Trap them. Separate Morrison from the rest of that mob. Without him leading them, they'll scatter." "It is a great risk," Nolish said. "You would be destroying your own mine." Samuel looked at the approaching riders, then at Ayanna standing beside him. He thought of Sarah and the mine that had become her tomb. It was a fitting end. "That mine is a grave," he said. "It's time I buried the ghosts." Nolish nodded. "Tell my warriors what you need." The plan was desperate, and they had only minutes. Samuel, with Ayanna and a dozen of the swiftest Apache warriors, disappeared back into the ventilation shaft. They moved through the darkness of the tunnels with a silent urgency. Samuel's mind, once filled with grief, was now sharp and clear, every forgotten tunnel and weak point of the rock mapped out in his memory. He led them to a spot directly above the main mine entrance. The rock here was fractured, a weak point he'd always been careful to avoid. "Here," he said to the warriors, "we need to break these support pillars, all at once." The warriors, using their heavy war clubs and the butts of their rifles, began to hammer at the thick wooden beams Samuel pointed out. The entire mountain seemed to groan around them. Dust rained down from the ceiling. Meanwhile, on the ridgetop, Chief Nolish and the rest of his warriors began a feint. They let loose a volley of arrows and rifle fire, not to kill, but to herd Morrison's mob toward the mouth of the canyon, right below the mine entrance. Morrison, blinded by his lust for gold, fell for it completely. He spurred his horse forward, leading the charge directly into the kill zone. "Now!" Samuel yelled in the tunnel. The warriors gave one last mighty heave. The support beams splintered, then shattered. With a deafening roar, the ceiling gave way. Tons of rock and earth cascaded down, a man-made avalanche. The ground shook. Outside, Morrison and the front line of his riders looked up in horror as the entire face of the mountain seemed to peel away. The mine entrance vanished under a tidal wave of rock. The canyon was completely blocked. The avalanche thundered down, swallowing the first dozen riders, including Jake Morrison, who disappeared in a cloud of dust and retribution. The rest of the mob, seeing their leader obliterated and their path blocked by a mountain of rubble, panicked. Their greed turned to fear. They turned and fled, scattering back into the desert like the vermin they were. Silence fell once more, broken only by the settling of dust and the distant echo of the rockfall. Samuel and the warriors emerged from a side tunnel, covered in dirt but alive. They climbed back to the ridgetop where the remaining Apache stood guard over their captives. Alistair Finch was still on the ground, his face pale with shock and defeat. The war was over before it had even begun, not with a massacre but with a miner's cleverness and a mountain's fury. In the quiet dawn that followed, the territorial marshal arrived with a small posse. He had been summoned by a messenger from Nolish days before. On the off chance the trap for Finch was successful, he took one look at Finch, at the dozens of disarmed mercenaries, and at the calm, resolute face of Chief Nolish, and he knew which story he'd be telling when he got back to the capital. Finch was arrested, his empire of deceit crumbling around him. The story of his illegal army and his plot to incite a war would be impossible to bury. Samuel stood with Ayanna and her grandfather, watching the sun rise over the canyon, its golden light hitting the newly exposed rock face where his mine used to be. And there, glinting in the morning sun, was a thick, unmistakable vein of pure gold, laid bare by the explosion. The dragon's hoard was real. "It is yours," Nolish said to Samuel. "You have earned it. Your knowledge saved my people. This wealth can build you a new life." Samuel looked at the gold, then at Ayanna. He thought of the lonely camp he'd left behind, the hollow man he had been. That man was gone, buried under the same rock that had claimed Jake Morrison. "My life is here now," Samuel said, his voice steady. "And the gold doesn't belong to one man. It belongs to the people of this mountain. Let's use it to build our future, to secure the treaty, to build a school, to make sure no man like Finch can ever threaten this place again." Ayanna looked at him, and her eyes weren't filled with the cunning of a warrior or the weight of a messenger. They were filled with a light that outshone the morning sun. She reached out and took his hand, their fingers intertwining. It wasn't the hesitant touch of a young girl, but the firm, confident grip of a partner. He had come to the desert to die, but in the heart of the dust and the rock, surrounded by a people he never knew, he had finally, truly learned how to live. His past was buried, his future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long, long time, he wasn't alone. And as he stood there on the edge of a new day, he knew his promise to Sarah was finally fulfilled. This story is a powerful reminder that sometimes the deepest darkness is just before the dawn, and the greatest treasures aren't buried in the ground, but in the choices we make and the people we choose to fight for. What would you have done? Would you have stayed hidden in the shadows, or would you have stepped into the firelight? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. And if you enjoyed this journey into the heart of the Old West, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss the next story we uncover.